Welcome, everybody. Great to have you here. Thanks for that. My name is Matthew Scott. I'm president of the Carnegie Institution for Science. Thrilled to see so many people coming to hear what I know will be an absolutely fascinating talk tonight. Some of you who haven't been here recently will notice that this auditorium has been completely rebuilt, maintaining its beautiful historical aspects, but far more functional than before. All new lighting, you've got carpet under your feet, you've got high definition projection and 14-channel surround sound, which we can't fully exercise tonight, but the staff chose to celebrate the completion of the renovation by showing Jurassic Park in here, and we had dinosaurs besides us in the seat. Of course, it's an anti-science movie, so I thought it was a rather odd choice for us for the first one, but it was great. It was fantastic. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about some background to this. So when our planet was formed 6,000 years ago, oh, wait a minute, that's... When our planet was formed 4.5 billion years ago, it was a fiery body of magma, roiling magma, bombarded constantly by asteroids and comets, without a trace of oxygen in its atmosphere. It was a grim place. Within 100 million years, however, barely a blink on the geologic timescale, life had taken hold. When and where and how remain unknowns. And we've had a wonderful workshop conference the past few days, still going on, many of you participating on the origins of life, and it's been fantastic to have this very interesting mix of scientists here the past several days. So, we do know that Earth's complex prebiotic environment was full of amino acids, constituents of proteins, and other small organic molecules. Somehow, these molecules combined into information-rich, self-organizing, and reproducible assemblages that evolved into life forms that spread into every nook and cranny on Earth. The modern era of experimental research into life's origins is generally acknowledged to have begun in the mid-1950s when the American chemists Stanley Miller and Harold Urey simulated the interaction between the presumed atmosphere and ocean of prebiotic Earth. Their result, that amino acids could be created from inorganic materials, was very exciting news until scientists began to realize some years later that amino acids are fairly common in the universe, as many of you have noticed. What Miller and Urey did accomplish, however, was to place the origin of life problem squarely in the chemist's domain. They also connected life's origins to the, quote, warm little pond, unquote, that 100 years earlier Charles Darwin had speculated could, as he said, with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, lights, heat, electricity, etc., unquote, eventually produce living matter. The primordial soup model implied that if enough organic molecules simmered long enough, then by sheer chance the right combinations would come together and life would arise. In recent years, scientists have explored the possibility that life arose not necessarily on Earth's surface in a warm pond, but instead deep in the ocean near thermal vents. They have also begun to seriously question the idea that chance alone was responsible. Rather, many think that life's origin was tied much more closely to deterministic physical laws. Some go so far as to suggest that the origin of life is a cosmic imperative. If true, then it is practically inevitable that someday we will find life elsewhere in the universe. And I want to mention that yesterday we broke ground in Chile for the Giant Magellan Telescope, which is the most powerful tool for doing that search ever to be built. And that's going along very well. We're very excited about the prospects it'll take 6 to 10 years to build this immense thing, but it'll be very good for this purpose. But would that life, the new life elsewhere, look anything like life on Earth? Our guest tonight, Carnegie mineralogist and astrobiologist, and I could use many other descriptors, Robert Hazen, would say probably not. His research suggests that terrestrial planets are subjected to physical, chemical, and at least in the case of Earth, biological processes that affect mineral diversity and evolution in both deterministic and random ways. The minerals, in turn, affect the origin and evolution of life. In turn, and this is something Bob has taught me, life affects the composition of minerals on the Earth in a profound way, and that's something I never even thought about until I started paying attention to him, which I should have done much sooner. Even if astronomers were to find a rocky planet the same size as Earth that revolves around a star the same size as the Sun and at the same distance, it is highly unlikely that the planet's minerals and life forms, if they exist, would be unique. Dr. Hazen's work has led to a field he calls mineral ecology, which explores the formation of minerals in the context of the evolving biosphere. Applying ecological strategies to mineralogy, very interesting, interdisciplinary, fresh kind of thinking, has helped Dr. Hazen and his colleagues, and many of the rest of us who are trying to think about these things, not only understand the roles that minerals play in life's emergence and evolution, it has also helped them approach mineralogy as a predictive, not just a descriptive science. Dr. Hazen is a senior scientist at Carnegie's Geophysical Laboratory here in Washington, D.C., just a little ways north of here, and the Clarence Robinson Professor of Earth Science at George Mason University. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees at MIT and his PhD at a theology school that's just up the river from there. It's Harvard. He spent a year as a NATO postdoctoral, I'm an MIT guy, I have to take digs when I can, as a NATO postdoctoral fellow at Cambridge University before joining Carnegie in 1976 as a research associate. He was appointed a staff member 2 years later. Among his many research interests are high pressure and high temperature crystallography, mineral surface chemistry, high pressure organic synthesis, the study and quantification of complex systems, and the roles of minerals in prebiotic chemistry. A very appropriate topic for the workshop we've just been having. He has been instrumental in launching several major interdisciplinary efforts, including Carnegie's participation in NASA's Astrobiology Institute, and he is a founder of Carnegie's Deep Carbon Observatory, where since 2008 he has served as executive director. This has now grown to a team effort of 1,000 scientists in more than 40 countries. He's a great person for triggering fantastic teamwork across large groups of scientists with many different skill sets. He's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He's received numerous awards, including the 1982 Mineralogical Society of America Award, the 1986 American Chemical Society Apatieff Prize, the 1989 ASCAP Deems Taylor Award, the 1998 Elizabeth Wood Science Writing Award, the 2009 Mineralogical Society of America's Distinguished Public Service Medal, and the 2011 Linnaeus Prize. He also has the rare distinction of having a mineral, Hazenite, named in his honor. How many of you have a mineral named in your honor? He is a member of the Executive Council of the International Society for the Study of the Origins of Life, a distinguished lecturer and former president of the Mineralogical Society of America, and a member of several advisory boards, including those of NOVA, the Carnegie Council, and the National Academy of Sciences Science and Entertainment Exchange. He has also been active in national efforts to reform science education. He's a favorite lecturer in this series. He's a master at conveying scientific information to the general public. He has been featured on dozens of radio and television programs, given countless lectures worldwide, and authored or co-authored over 20 books, including The Story of Earth, the first 4.5 billion years from stardust to living planets, which was published in 2012, and the subject of an episode in a NOVA television program that's currently airing on PBS. No introduction of Robert Hazen would be complete without mentioning his many extracurricular activities, for not only is he an exceptional scientist and science communicator, he is also a science and music historian, a professional trumpeter, an amateur cellist, and a trilobite collector par excellence. So I can add to all that, as though that's not enough, if this thing does this, he is also this year, just 2 weeks ago in fact, and here he is where he'd really rather be probably than where he is tonight, I'm guessing. He has just been given the highest honor of the Mineralogical Society of America, which is the Roebling Medalist recognition, and that just happened, and we're thrilled to have yet another celebration of his amazing accomplishments. Now, I just want to mention Roebling, because some of you who have read David McCulloch's wonderful history of the Brooklyn Bridge, the Great Bridge, know the Roebling family of cable makers whose technology and then later design allowed that bridge to be built. So the father Roebling designed it, this Roebling built it. He was also a mineralogist, incredibly accomplished man. It's a very dramatic story of how he supervised the building of this bridge from his sickbed, mediated by his wife's wisdom, who really led the engineers. She was the one who told the engineers what really they should do. So this Roebling prize then is tied to a bridge, and what could be a more perfect metaphor for its latest recipient? Now, the other thing I want to mention is that we're trying to corner the market on Mineralogical Society prizes. As I mentioned, Bob had a previous one, and this year, at the same time this was announced, we had this one announced. So, first of all, Annette, who's shown here and is here tonight, had already this year won the Clark Medal of the Geophysical Society. So that's one major society, huge recognition. We all celebrated. We thought that was it. And then along came the second one. So this is the Mineralogical Society of America Award, which just came also the week before last. So Bob can come up here. Maybe Annette can stand up wherever she is. And there she is. Are we a little proud of our scientists? We are. Guilty as charged. So Bob, thank you, and take the stage.
Matt, thank you for that generous introduction. It's such a privilege and a pleasure to be here this evening with family, with friends, with so many colleagues. It's a little daunting, too, because sitting in front of me are some of the world's foremost researchers in the origin of life field, people who have profound influence on the field, about which I'd like to touch on this evening. I know there's a way to get this started. Try that. Yay. So tonight I want to introduce some ideas about the origins of life. And some of these are quite new, just formulated in the last few weeks and never presented before to an audience. So there's a little bit of trepidation here, but also a great deal of excitement because I love this subject. I love talking about the great questions that face us when we study this field. Is life a cosmic imperative? How can we go into a laboratory and study this incredible ancient event? Are we alone in the universe? These are the questions we address in the origin of life field. And what I want to do tonight, I have three objectives. The first is just give a quick overview of this field, the scientific study of the origins of life. And I want to do this by focusing on one aspect of origins, and that's chemical reactions. Because the origin of life, amongst other things, was a sequence of chemical reactions. I then want to examine this question of chance versus necessity, which is so often brought up in the context of origins, and I would like to propose that this is a false dichotomy, thinking about the extremes of this, that rather we need to look in the middle about probabilities. And finally, I want to look at this question of improbable events, things that might never be possible in the laboratory, and yet when you have an Earth-like planet with immense time and spatial scales, that the combinatorial richness of a planet of that sort makes certain inevitable chemical processes, things that we might not see in a laboratory. So let's begin and look at the origin of life as a chemical process. So there are three basic assumptions we make: that the first life forms were carbon-based, just like life today, not some exotic chemistry. The raw materials, exactly what you'd expect on an Earth-like planet. You have an atmosphere, you have ocean, you have rocks, you have minerals. Those are the raw materials. And that life's origin can be thought of as a sequence of chemical reactions. That's the key, a sequence of chemical reactions. Okay, just to remind you, what's a chemical reaction? Well, this is when you have atoms come together and you rearrange the atoms, rearrange the electrons. There are lots of familiar ones. Rusting of an old automobile, of iron. Cooking an egg, for example. And acid. And these are classic reactions, familiar in everyday experience, which are exactly the same reactions that occur in the origin of life. They're called oxidation-reduction reactions, polymerization and depolymerization reactions, hydration, dehydration, also acid-base reactions. And in each of these, you have very simple exchanges of electrons, of water, of protons, and in the case of polymerization, depolymerization, building strands of long molecules or breaking them apart. This is what life does extremely well. Chemical reactions that are the fundamental attribute of living systems. And we think that life began as a sequence of chemical reactions. And I'd like to describe three of these steps. The first is the chemical reactions that made the basic simple biomolecules like amino acids and sugars. And then we had chemical reactions that organized those into larger structures, membranes, polymers. And finally, getting a cycle, a self-replicating cycle of chemical reactions, which is really, I think, the key point, demarcation point for the origin of life, when a group of molecules could make copies. Okay, so let's think about this first step, making the basic biomolecules with chemical reactions. And the idea here is you just start with water and volcanic gases, very simple molecules, and you want to make carbon-carbon bonds, represented here by the two dark circles. So there's acetic acid with 2 carbons, then you go to pyruvic acid with 3 carbons, and you build larger and larger molecules of various sorts. That's what we're trying to do. Now, there are lots of ways to do it, and Matt alluded to the very first famous experiment of this sort, the Miller-Urey experiment from the early 1950s. Stanley Miller, the young graduate student at the University of Chicago, his mentor, the Nobel Prize-winning Harold Urey, and they basically had a simple apparatus of glass with water gently boiling and an atmosphere with electric sparks. And what they produced were a whole series of molecules that were fundamental building blocks of life, the amino acids that make proteins, the sugars that make carbohydrates, various sorts of carboxylic acids that play a role in metabolism, and also molecules that form cell membranes, even some of the building blocks of DNA and RNA. For all the world, this looked like a balanced diet. And so people thought this problem had been solved. Well, of course, it hasn't been solved yet, but this was a really good first step. And then you take this and you look at other environments, energetic environments, and it turns out these molecules can form in many different places. So for example, in dense molecular clouds deep within our galaxy, we find areas where ultraviolet radiation bombards small molecules and makes bigger organic molecules. These results can be simulated in laboratory experiments, for example, by Lou Amendola at the NASA Ames Research Laboratories in California. And then we have this hydrothermal hypothesis that chemical reactions can occur at volcanic vents on the ocean floor. To do these experiments at the Geophysical laboratory, we use gold tube reactors. We seal various ingredients to that, then we have to analyze them, and George Cody has played a real leading role in this. I'm sure George is here someplace, but I've got to thank George and Sarah Walker, who put together this incredible conference that we're experiencing this week. So George plays this role, and we can synthesize a whole variety of molecules. And not only that, this is something brand new. Dmitry Sverdlensky, who's here this evening, Dmitry has recently proposed a model to understand how fluids and rocks interact, not just in the crust, but at much more extreme conditions in the mantle. And remarkably, that when you have certain conditions, for example, in the upper mantle, a place where Earth's crust is being subducted down into the mantle, you find that you actually can make organic molecules at mantle conditions. This is a complete surprise to me anyway. And what you find is, depending on the conditions, the pH and the oxidation state, you can either form oil-like molecules or vinegar-like molecules. And so a suite of organic molecules forming in Earth's mantle. So it turns out, in conclusion, there's many, many different ways to do these chemical reactions. Making these small biological molecules seems like quite an easy aspect, something that's an inevitable deterministic aspect of Earth-like planets. Okay, then the next step is really critical, because the trouble with these synthetic processes, Miller-Urey and so forth, is you make molecules indiscriminately. You make thousands, tens of thousands of molecules. And yet life uses only relatively few molecules, maybe 500 different molecules in all. And so the question is, what prebiotic processes select and organize, concentrate these molecules? And so here we have to look for different kinds of chemical reactions. I'm going to tell you about two of them. The first one has to do with what's called self-organization. And I learned about this because one of our early experiments, we tried to do very simple things. We said, let's put this pyruvate with 3 carbons into a gold tube and put it with CO2, and maybe we'll make 4 carbons. Wouldn't that be nice? So we tried this, very simple conditions, 200 degrees Celsius, 2,000 atmospheres, 2 hours we ran this. And what we got instead was a thick brown oily goo, something that clearly was not a simple chemical reaction. And when you did an analysis of this, George Cody showed us this chart, and there's literally tens of thousands of different molecules represented here by different peaks in that hump there. And that's way too much stuff for the origin of life. It actually is a little discouraging in a way. I said, what are we going to do? And so along comes Dave Deemer, a colleague at the University of California in Santa Cruz. He says, well, have you tried putting a drop of that oil in water? And I said, Dave, why would we want to do that? And he said, well, maybe it will self-organize into a vesicle. That is a device where these molecules, where one end dislikes water and the other end loves it, will self-organize when you put it into water into these little structures. And lo and behold, we put a little drop of this in, and these beautiful structures, these fluorescent structures, were seen in the microscope. They're roughly the size and shapes of cells. They have an inside filled with water. And these certainly are not cells, but this is the process of self-organization that must have been part of the formation of cell membranes long, long ago. Well, many molecules are not soluble they're soluble in water, then they can't do this self-organization trick. And so there you have to use mineral surfaces. And as a mineralogist, I love this. This is where I sort of look at these specimens that I collected when I was a teenager in Paterson, New Jersey, and said, wow, look at that. These are faces of quartz crystals, a very common mineral. But if you look closely, you'll see that some faces are coated with a red mineral, that's hematite or rust, and other faces are not. What's going on? Well, it turns out that different faces have different terminal crystal structures, and so some molecules stick and some molecules don't. And you have to know, when you see a quartz crystal like this, all the different ways that the atoms can form different surface structures. Now, what most origin of life people have done in the past is take a quartz crystal and grind it up to a fine powder. But when you do that, you lose all the surface information. So we have to do something different. And what we did then has been using large single crystals and seeing what sticks and what doesn't. So this is one particularly fun experiment. One of the attributes of life is that it uses only the left-handed amino acids and only the right-handed sugars. But in prebiotic synthesis, you make equal amounts of both. So how in the world can you separate and isolate left-handed, right-handed molecules? I said maybe you could do it on left and right-handed surfaces. And so I took nice big calcite crystals like this. There's a right-handed face, there's a left-handed face. You take this, you stick it in a solution with a 50% mixture of left and right-handed molecules, let it sit overnight, pull it out, wash it off, and lo and behold, in this particular case, you've got a concentration of one kind of molecule here, another kind of molecule here. So that's one way that mineral surfaces can give you an advantage. And not only can we see that happening, but we also can do very quantitative analysis of the surface. We find that the right-handed molecule fits perfectly on what we call the right-handed surface with 3 points of attachment and very little distortion of the crystal structure. But if you put this left-handed molecule on that surface, you see the terrible distortions. That's a very energetically bad thing to do. And there's only 2 points of attachment. So here's a case where we can understand in detail that selection of molecules. So here we have prebiotic molecules. They can be selected either by self-assembly or by absorption of mineral surfaces. So I think at least we understand in principle this part of the story. Now the third kinds of chemical reactions, this is the big step that we're all really hoping to accomplish soon. In fact, this is the holy grail, the idea of a cycle of chemical reactions that's self-replicating. Here's one idea. This is the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle, sometimes called the citric acid cycle. And if you run this counterclockwise, what happens is you start with small molecules like acetic acid and pyruvic acid. You add other small molecules and you go around till you eventually get all the way up to citric acid here. Then this splits apart to 2 plus 4, and you go, one cycle becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, and this becomes then a self-replicating cycle. And it's a cycle of chemical reactions, about a dozen reactions in all, and each of those is one of the steps then in this idea of the origin of life. Now that's not the only idea out there for a self-replicating system. This is another one introduced by Stuart Kaufman and colleagues at the Santa Fe Institute. It's the idea of an autocatalytic network. It's more than a cycle because it's got many, many different molecules, each labeled with a box here. And every one of those arrows is a chemical reaction. And the idea is if you have a set, maybe 100, maybe 1,000 molecules, and every molecule reinforces at least one other molecule in the system, and it all folds back into a nice package, then those molecules win and everything else loses. And then eventually through evolution, you get a smaller, you winnow away the things that are less efficient, you make the cycle more efficient. That's Stuart Kaufman's idea. And yet there's another idea about self-replicating molecules. This is the RNA world, where RNA, a molecule that can carry genetic information, can also make copies of itself. And so if such a molecule could be found, I think this might be the model to beat. In any case, what we find, we haven't yet synthesized in the laboratory a plausible prebiotic self-replicating cycle of chemical reactions. But I think we're getting very, very close, and this could be one of the most exciting advances to come out of a meeting like the one we had this week. Okay, there's actually a fourth step, but this is biological evolution by natural selection. Because once you have a cycle of molecules that makes copies of itself, then mutations are inevitable. And by mutations, I mean chemical reactions that go just a little bit wrong, where you have the wrong set of atoms, but they fit very neatly into these structures. And in some environments, they might be an advantage. And so you start seeing evolution and competition. It's inevitable that Darwinian selection will appear at a time like this, and evolution takes off. And that's really the origin of life. Okay, so my conclusion, we can think about the origin of life as a sequence of chemical reactions. And it's that sequence then that defines what we're trying to study in the laboratory. I want to make one very important point here too, that this is sort of a model of what looks like might lead to life on Earth today. But there may be many, many other pathways, making small molecules, selecting them, finding a self-replicating cycle that is completely different from Earth's biochemistry. We don't know. We don't know how many different plausible biochemistries they are. But I think they all have to have something like this character as you go through. Okay, so that's the end of part one. Part two is this idea of chance versus necessity. And here I want to examine the question about the inevitability of life. Now, so the question really boils down to chemical reactions on Earth. They display a wide range of probabilities. And from those probabilities, can you distinguish between this dichotomy of chance versus necessity? Chance versus necessity has been a philosophical debate for a very long time, but it was brought into the modern realm of biology by Jacques Monod, Nobel Prize winner who played key roles in understanding how the genetic code and information makes proteins. And he saw in the sort of random combinatorial richness of the genetic code a rather pessimistic view of the possibility of reproducing life elsewhere. And so he said the universe is not pregnant with life, nor the biosphere with man. Man at last knows that he is alone. Oh, this is so French. In the unfeeling immensity of the universe out of which he emerged by chance. Okay, that's, not everybody agreed with him. Okay, and so for example, there was a counter book by Ernest Schopenhauer, this was in 1976, called Anti-Chance, and he had a very diametrically opposite point of view. The origin of life and evolution were necessary because the conditions of Earth and the existing properties of the elements were necessary. Chance versus necessity. Now, both of these books have rather nuanced arguments. They're somewhat dense to read. But I think it's safe to say that the general public, and indeed most of us in the scientific community, have changed these two books into Either life's inevitable or life's incredibly rare. Chance, necessity, it's a dichotomy. And what I want to argue is that it ain't necessarily those extremes. There may be something in the middle. So here's the idea. Earth's chemical reactions display a wide range of probabilities. But for organic reactions, it's really hard to say what those probabilities might be. So what I want to do is answer the question using minerals, because each mineral represents a chemical reaction on Earth, and we can tell you exactly what the probabilities are. And the reason we can say that is because of this new field of mineral ecology. Mineral ecology studies the diversity and distribution of minerals on Earth, and it allows you to ask this question: what are the relative roles of chance and necessity in Earth's mineral evolution? So here's where this came from, and I'm so happy to be here this evening and be able to thank Matt Scott directly, because it was in June of 2014 that he invited me on a walk in the woods. This is a beautiful redwood forest in Northern California. We were talking about basically the organization of complex systems. We were talking about biology systems. We were talking about mineralogical systems. We were talking about institutional systems like the Carnegie Institution of Washington. And what struck me in that conversation, I should have realized this before, but when you look at a redwood forest, almost all the biomass is redwood trees. But the diversity is of all those small things, the yellow slugs and the little ferns and the other things. That's where the diversity comes from, is the small, rare species. And furthermore, by counting species, you can predict the number of missing species. And I started wondering, can I do this with mineralogy? Now, in biology, the way you do it is you look at the abundance, you look at the first individual you find, that's a new species, look at the second one, the third one, and you start counting the number of individuals and the number of species, and eventually this rises up asymptotically to some number, and that predicts the number of species. You can also do this with genomes. If you have microbes, you count sequences of DNA, and you find eventually you can predict how many microbes exist in a population based on the ones you've just looked at. I wondered, could you do this with minerals? And it turns out the mathematics from the ecosystems of biology weren't quite the right mathematics. Instead, it turns out what works is lexical statistics. There's an analogy between the distribution of minerals on Earth and words in a book. Specifically, most words are common, a, and the, but it's the rare words that define the diversity of a vocabulary. It defines the genre, it defines the authorship. And our great good fortune is that this mathematics, these statistics, have been exquisitely developed by, wait for it, the NSA. Because they need to analyze emails and manifestos. It was really written by so-and-so and so forth. But you can use those mathematics to analyze minerals, because minerals have the exact same distribution. It's called a large number of rare event distribution, and here's how it works. On the horizontal scale, the number of mineral localities. And so this point would be minerals that occur at exactly 4,000 localities, or 2,000 localities, or exactly one locality. On the vertical scale is the number of species that can form that. And you have a few minerals that are extremely common, others that are relatively common, things like diamond, which you may think are rare, but really are not rare at all, 700 localities. But then there are the real rarities. Bob Downsite, named after my friend at the University of Arizona, 3 localities. Hazenite, only 1 locality. We're still looking, but I think it's Mono Lake in California. It's microbial excreta. My friend Sean Solomon says Hazenite happens. What can I say? So anyway, look at this is the idea. This is so fun. A few minerals dominate Earth's crustal volume, but most species are rare. And so they follow this thing called a large number of rare event frequency distribution. Here's what it looks like in detail. Minerals from exactly 1 locality, exactly 2, exactly 3. You see there's about 5,000 known mineral species, and more than 1,000 of them are known from only a single locality. Another 600 are known from only 2 localities, 400 from only 3 localities. In fact, more than half of all mineral species are known from 5 or fewer localities. What you see here is the mathematical model developed by Greta Heisted, applying these lexical statistics to mineralogy. It's a large number of rare event distribution. In black is the observed number of minerals. In red is our model. And from that model, we can do 2 things. The first thing we can do is predict the number of missing minerals. And we do it on a graph like this. On the horizontal scale are the number of observations of minerals at a locality. Calcite from Carthage, Tennessee. That's one data point. And there are about 650,000 data points now. On the vertical scale, the number of different mineral species. And as you find more mineral locality pairs, you will find more species. It begins very, very steeply because the first bunch of minerals that you discover are likely to be fairly new ones. But as you discover more and more, it starts leveling off. There's where we were as of February 2014, 4,831 minerals, about 653,000 counts. And this allows us then to extrapolate into the future. Say, as we discover more, we're going to find that there are about 6,437 minerals, and there's a big error bar on that. But what it means is there's roughly 1,500 missing minerals on Earth. And furthermore, using other statistical methods, we can say what those minerals probably are, where to go to find them. It makes mineralogy predictive. That's one thing we can do. The other thing we can do, and this is really cool, this is brand new stuff, we can predict the probability of each of those minerals being found on an Earth-like planet. And here's what you see. There's a rank. Here's one is the commonest mineral on Earth, the 1,000th common, 4,000, up to 6,400 some. And what you find is that there's a bunch of minerals, 2,800 of them, where there's a greater than 90% chance of finding those minerals. And there's a bunch more where it's about a 50% or greater chance. But there's a lot of minerals, more than 1,800 species, that's less than a 50-50 chance of finding them if you replayed the tape of an Earth-like planet. Now, so what does this mean in terms of chance versus necessity? Well, those are necessity. Deterministic minerals, probability close to 100%. And there's a bunch of those. And these are chance, probability less than 10%. But a huge fraction of the minerals are in between. It's not chance, it's not necessity, it's just a probability. And that's what a probability distribution gives you. So we can say with some certainty what are the probabilities of each of these chemical reactions, each mineral. That's what it is. So each mineral represents a chemical reaction. We can say which ones are more likely, which are less likely. And I would argue that the same kinds of statistics that we go for the chemical reactions that produce minerals probably in some way apply to the chemical reactions for organic molecules that led to the origin of life. And so I would say some chemical reactions are more likely, some are less likely. We have a sequence of chemical reactions. And again, I point to the fact there may be many different pathways to go from the early chemical reactions to a self-replicating system. So that's the conclusion to part 2. And it's the idea that chance and necessity, I think, is a false dichotomy. It just simply, it's lazy thinking. We have to think much more subtly about probabilities. And even if in a laboratory setting, it is improbable. It is just a frozen accident if you find something in a laboratory. Now I would argue point 3, and that's that at the scale of a planet, things may be inevitable, even though they're difficult to reproduce or impossible to reproduce in a laboratory. And here's what I mean. At a laboratory scale, we're talking about short periods of time, short periods of space. Planets, we're talking about huge times and huge spaces. So I want to ask a question, and that's how many origin experiments can an Earth-like planet do? In other words, how many chemical reactions can occur on an Earth-like planet? And by chemical reaction, I mean a specific combination of molecules coming together from a soup or from a fluid. There's a mineral surface, they come down on the surface, they interact on that surface and form something new. And so here's what I did, back of the envelope calculation, and this is always fun. This is what scientists do. There's an envelope, and there's some scribbles, but this is literally what you do on an airplane or something. You figure this out. And here's what you have to do. You have to answer 4 questions to come up with a back of the envelope estimate of how many chemical reactions Earth could have produced. First thing is, how long does it take for a reaction to occur on a mineral surface? And how much surface area does that require? So now we're talking about a single experiment, and I would argue that's a very, very short period of time on a very tiny area. Then we think about Earth. How much time does Earth have to do this, and how much surface area of minerals does an Earth-like planet give you? So we're going to do these 4 quick estimation calculations. Question number 1, how long does it take? And this is those of you who know about surface chemistry realize that this is a really difficult average calculation because there's some surface reactions that take place in a millionth of a second, and other times molecules may stick on a surface and last there for years. So there's no real single number, but the sort of average for reactions on surfaces range from about 100th to a second to 100 seconds. And just to be conservative, I'm going to say let's assume that an average experiment takes 10 seconds on a surface. That's a long time for molecules, but let's say that that's what it is. So that's the answer to question number 1. Question number 2. What's the surface area of one of these reactions? And most molecules are less than a few nanometers in maximum dimension. Most surfaces have repeats that are less than a few nanometers. But just to be conservative again, let's say that we have a surface that's about 10 nanometers by 10 nanometers. That's 10 billionths of a meter by 10 billionths of a meter. And that gives us an answer that an experiment takes about 10 to the minus 12th centimeters squared. That's the answer to question 2. Question 3, how long did Earth have? Well, we know that life was clearly present 3.5 billion years ago, and there's pretty convincing evidence that life was also present 4 billion years ago, or roughly thereabouts. But just to sort of give us, Earth is 4.55 billion years old. So let's say that we had about 600 million years to play with. That's 2 times 10 to the 16th seconds. That's the answer to question number 3. And now comes question number 4, which is by far the most subtle and difficult sort of to work your way through. But here's Earth. Earth has a surface area of about 500 million square kilometers, which is 5 times 10 to the 18th square centimeters. That's just the area of the planet. But we want to know the area of minerals on the planet. And if you think about the surface, it has all these fine-grained materials. It has sand. It has, it has this plumes of sort of very nanoscale minerals that are coming out of black smokers in the ocean floor. It has volcanic ash coming out. These have very high surface areas. But by far the largest surface area has to do with clay minerals. And typically, clay minerals have an area, a surface area. I find this just incomprehensible. 2 million square centimeters per cubic centimeter of clay. What does that mean? Okay, here's a sugar cube. That's like a cubic centimeter. And if you could take this out of clay mineral, it would coat the area of a tennis court. 2 cubic centimeters of clay that I collected a couple weekends ago out of the Chesapeake Bay. This clay, if we could spread out all the surface area, would be the size of the auditorium. Okay, that's astonishing. Now, another thing you need to know is that Earth's surface probably had, on average, at least a meter of clay minerals and other fine-grained minerals over its surface. And if you look at ocean drill cores of sediments now, of course, it can be tens or hundreds of meters. If you look at sediments on the land, typically this is a clay-rich soil, much more than a meter. But let's say it's in meters. That's a 100-centimeter column. So for every square centimeter of Earth's surface, there was 100 cubic centimeters of clay minerals. Okay? And so if you multiply this out, there's Earth's surface in square centimeters, 100 cubic centimeters per centimeter squared of clays. That gives you 500,000 cubic kilometers of clay. That's a lot of clay. That's just a whole lot of clay. And so now you have to do one more multiplication. There's all the clay minerals, and you multiply each of those square centimeters by a tennis court size area. And what you come up with is that Earth had 10 to the 27th square centimeters of mineral surface area. Admittedly, a very, very rough kind of calculation, but that's what a back of the envelope calculation is. That's the answer to question 4. And now all we have to do is just multiply and divide these things. Earth has 10 to the 27th square centimeters. That's question 4. It had 2 times 10 to the 16th seconds. That's question 3. Each experiment, then, you divide by the area of a single experiment, 10 to the minus 12 centimeters squared, and the time, 10 seconds per experiment. And when you do that math, 2 times 10 to the 54th chemical reactions for Earth-like planet. Truly an astronomical number. 2 trillion, quadrillion chemical reactions occurring in the time given to us for prebiotic chemistry. That's a lot more chemical reactions than a graduate student could perform in a thesis. So here's the point, that you can imagine there's some steps. You've got these chemical steps, chemical reactions, one after another leading to the origin of life. At some point, there may be one step that's much less probable. That is, it requires the juxtaposition of a whole bunch of different molecules on just the right kind of surface with just the right kind of temperature and pH and other conditions. And that may be the bottleneck for the origin of life. And to find that bottleneck in the laboratory experiment may be virtually impossible. It may be something that even with all our chemical intuition we may never find. And yet, Earth's doing this 2 times 10 to the 54th times, and ultimately it may just through, even if it only happens once every 10 to the 50th times, you've still got 10,000 origins of life. So that's the kind of thing that combinatorics gives you. So these numbers are very approximate, but I think the power of this kind of reasoning is important. Planetary scales of time and space give you huge numbers of chemical reactions, and you can sample those over long periods of time. So, do we give up? Of course not, because we have, we know about chemistry. We can use our chemical intuition, physical intuition. We can eliminate lots of the possibilities. We can work backwards from today's biology, because that gives us real strong hints. We can try new approaches. They're combinatorial chemistry approaches. They're computational approaches that will help us sort through vast numbers of reactions. And of course, we have incredible, great students who's going to do this work for us. And I've got to say that this is one of the most profoundly exciting things at this conference this week and in my own laboratory life, the experience of working with these incredible young people, their brilliance, their insights, their ability to carry on ideas that you think, oh, you can't do that, and they go ahead and they do it. It's just amazing. This is going to be the future. So, my conclusions. You can understand life's origins as a sequence of chemical reactions, that characterizing these chemical reactions as being inevitable or frozen accidents is really a false dichotomy. There's probabilities in between. And that even if we can't necessarily imagine doing all of those steps, those chemical steps in the laboratory, Earth can do it because of its combinatorial richness. We're approaching a time in the history of origin of life studies when I think we're catching real glimpses of the endpoint. I truly believe that life is a cosmic imperative. And I think we're approaching the time we will know that we are not alone in the universe. Thank you very much.
Questions? We have microphones for questions there and there.
And there's a microphone. Yes, please.
I guess the one thing that I find a little bit disheartening is for decades we've been looking for signs of life, and we found nothing up to now outside our solar system. And if the universe is 14 billion years old, we say other planets maybe follow the same path we did and they had life, then you would have life forms that were as sophisticated as we are today, but they started 1 million years earlier than we did, so they'd be 1 million years beyond us and would have populated the universe, and it's improbable that we would just have no idea that they're out there. We'd see no signals, nothing. So is that something to be worried about, or we just don't have the technology to sense what's out there?
I don't think it's something to be worried about at all. First of all, in terms of non-intelligent life, we really haven't explored any worlds. We're just beginning to look at Mars in the kind of detail that would allow us to see microbial life or very primitive life of that sort. In terms of intelligent life, it may be that the window of communicating by radio waves is just incredibly tiny. I mean, think how much energy we waste when we blast our radio signals out into space. And if a really advanced society just wouldn't bother to do that. So, right? I mean, what can I say? And we may be all wireless, we may be all wired up cables, optical cables, and so forth. But there are actually some people in this audience that are far more experts and have thought deeply about this point. And there's a very rich literature should we be discouraged or not? And I think the general consensus is that we haven't looked far enough and in the right ways to be sure.
Distance is the answer.
Okay, yeah.
Excuse me. So your calculations for innate origins of life on planet Earth, 2 times 10 to the 54th. So that's for innate origins. How does that compare, let's say, to a back-of-the-envelope calculation for an importation theory, which is that these chemical reactions may have taken place elsewhere and been imported because of collision?
So when you look at a picture like this of a galaxy like the Milky Way galaxy, you're looking at hundreds of billions of stars, probably hundreds of billions of planets, terrestrial planets. And so certainly if life's a cosmic imperative, you have to think you're looking at a great many different living worlds here. And so one of the theories, one of the hypotheses we have to look at is the possibility of life being seeded from elsewhere, called panspermia. I'd say the most conservative version of that has to do with the fact that Mars was wet and temperate earlier than Earth, and it's possible that if life arises quickly, then life could have arisen on Mars, microbial life. There could have been an impact. It moved a Mars meteorite to Earth, and so before Earth really had a chance to get its own life jump-started, we're all Martians. That's one very viable hypothesis. But I think we really need to keep an open mind. But amongst the origin of life workers that are here, I know we all would say, if you say you move it to some other planet or some other star system, you're just deferring a problem that still has to be solved as a chemical, physical property of emergence.
I guess then to follow quickly, do you have, or do your colleagues have a back-of-the-envelope theory or calculation about which of these scenarios is the more likely? It's the same basic problem, but innate here on Earth or importation or?
I'm interested. That's a fascinating question. Does anybody from our group want to chime in here? Because I feel like I'm a novice here learning from some of the people who are in the audience. There may be someone who feels strongly. I certainly don't have a real strong feeling about that, but there may be someone does. Please chime in. I'm just here with everybody else.
Okay, over here. This side of the hall is winning, by the way, so you guys step it up.
You want to go to the mic? Yeah.
What is the Deep Carbon Observatory, or maybe I should say, what is the purpose? What are you trying to do with that?
Fantastic. The Deep Carbon Observatory is an initiative that's been sponsored with core funding by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to really understand Earth's carbon cycle from crust to core. That so much of the discussion of the carbon cycle has to do with the atmospheres, oceans, the effects of climate and environment and so forth. And we say there's a baseline. We need to understand how volcanoes work. We need to understand how subduction works. We need to understand if there's carbon in the core and in the mantle, and if that ever exchanges with the surface. We need to understand the long-term carbon cycling as well as the short-term. It also is very much part of this to understand deep microbial life. If you drill a hole right here, a kilometer down, and pull up that core, you're going to find microbes living far underground, and those microbes don't see sunlight. And sometimes they're isolated from the surface for millions of years, and yet there's a rich microbial community. We also understand that with work of Dmitry Svrogensky and others, that there's a whole organic chemistry that's going on in the mantle. I mean, that's amazing. That's a shocking, these discoveries are profound. And so the Deep Carbon, it's a 10-year program. We have, on the order of a few $100 million in funding, and we have, as Matt said, 1,000 people in 45 countries doing a wide range of things. But most important, and to me, what's most profound, is the integration of biology, chemistry, physics, astrophysics, understanding a full range of the sciences and seamlessly tackling a problem, which is exactly what we need to do as an origin of life community. We have to look beyond our narrow specialties and see this as an integrated endeavor.
Well, actually, that's one answer to what the DCO is. To me, the carbon is just an excuse for having set up the most interesting sociological experiment involving physicists and chemists ever. I mean, if you went around and said, what kind of mechanism would it take to get 1,000 people from 40 countries to work together, to share their, not only results, to share their experiments and their pieces. Oh, let's look at carbon. I mean, that would have been one of the most interesting experiments ever. And you should publish some sociological results too, and not just the physics and chemistry. But I do have a question, not about the decarbonization. You're sort of assuming a certain amount of stability through these 4.5 billion years. The probabilities don't change over time. And yet, the other part of you, not that you're schizophrenic, of course, but the other part of you is working really hard on how processes interact with other processes to change the environment. If you, not that you've exactly solved the static problem, but if you introduced a certain amount of interaction and feedback from the processes as they go, would the numbers change dramatically? Would the results change dramatically?
That is an amazing question. I've not thought about that at all, but you're absolutely right that you can't think of this as being a static set of reactions because the number of minerals, the diversity of minerals is increasing, and therefore the kinds of chemical reactions that can occur is changing, and so the probabilities do change significantly over time. If, for example, a chemical reaction requires a molybdate, well, there were no molybdates before the origin of life. I mean, you really can't resort to molybdates for that process, and by the same tokens, different minerals come in at a different time. So thank you very much. That's got me thinking, and this is going to work. I'm going to steal that idea. It's going to work its way into a paper, I guarantee you.
So this might be a really basic question, but one of the things I was thinking about when you did the calculation of the total number of experiments is is there a thought about the distribution of the elements themselves before you, like, if it was just carbon and nitrogen or the relative proportions and that sort of thing, and yeah, that's...
Yes, that'd be an extremely important thing to think about in a more nuanced calculation. I'm just assuming a milieu in which all different kinds of reactions are occurring in all different places. Some are terrestrial, some are in shallow little ponds with fresh water, some are on the ocean floor, and certainly you'd have a great mixture of chemical environments. But one of the interesting things, and referring back to the previous question, is that life is what gives us the incredible diversity of chemical environments at or near Earth's surface. Prior to that, if you look at the surface of Mars, it's much more chemically homogeneous at the surface scale. And so before you had life, maybe there are far, far fewer opportunities for different kinds of chemical reactions, and that's something I have to think about a lot more.
So what about like the distribution of the basic elements? Not the like where they go from there, but...
So all the elements would have been there. It's just that they'd be not as concentrated. So the ore deposits that we think of where you concentrate nickel and cobalt and copper and gold, those would not have been nearly as developed, more dispersed. So in that case, if you require high concentrations of one of those elements for a key step in the origin of life, you'd have to wait a long time.
Okay, thank you.
John?
Since left-handed amino acids form proteins, not right-handed ones, and since the left-handed amino acids bind preferentially to the left face of your calcite, does that mean that life evolved in Tennessee?
I wasn't expecting that. I was ready to give you a technical explanation. I love it. Thank you. This is such a great audience. I'll tell you. It is certainly true, though, if you think about the origin of life as occurring on 100 nanometers square, then if you have surfaces that are biased left-handed and right-handed, it can solve this handedness problem for you without having to have a global chiral bias. So they're equal numbers of left and right faces, but if you're the molecule in this face, you don't see the rest of the world, you just see that face. And that's sort of one idea that's floating out there.
So one of the assumptions, I'm not sure if it's just from science fiction or from what I know of astrobiology, is when you look at a planet and you look at the chemical makeup, you say, was this compatible with life? Does it have water? Does it have carbon dioxide? What is the inevitability that life, based on the laws of chemistry, requires some sort of carbon-based form? I mean, what's the probability, and are there other types of other element-based forms of life that we can conceive of at the moment?
Carbon is unique in the periodic table in its ability to both bind to itself and have extremely plastic variations, building rings and branches and chains and so forth. There's no other element that does the same thing at the kinds of temperatures and pressures we find at Earth's surface. And therefore, I think almost everyone in the origin of life field would say that the carbon-based life is essential. There have been a few interesting hypotheses, clay-based life, for example, because clay can have sequences of layers that vary slightly from one to the next, and therefore could conceivably carry information, and if you split the clay apart, it would reproduce that information. But those ideas are really marginal at this point. Carbon-based life and carbon chemistry, I think, is really seen as essential in any viable origin scenario.
I heard a report recently that somebody suggested that life actually may have arisen more than once in the Earth already. Looking at these minerals that people commonly use to measure the age of the rocks by looking at the uranium and lead concentrations, they looked at it and they found some carbon inclusions, and they saw that the isotopic characteristics suggested it was life, and that these were before the bombardment stage, which would have killed all life on Earth. And so if you had it created twice already, I don't know if anybody in this audience is dealing with that.
So I think a lot of us in the field would argue that it depends on what that choke point was in terms of reactions, but just to say you had 10 to the 50th experiments and it arises once every 10 to the 49th, then you would have had 10 origins of life. And probably what happens is some of those are more efficient, some of those are less efficient. If they met, one would eat the other one, and you'd end up with whatever wins. To me, it's actually very similar to the way planets form from planetesimals. You have dust and gas get larger and larger. The biggest one always wins. It swallows up everything else. And so in that sense that you end up with one winner and you end up with everything else being kind of swallowed up.
So, begin with the disclaimer here. I don't know much about rocks and so forth, but I was wondering if you could tell the difference between, let's say, 50 and 100 million years. I don't know if there's any history, if you could look back at sort of the development and say, maybe things spread from this location or that location to kind of bound your probability for life occurring. I don't know if that history is wiped out or along those lines.
This is an absolutely fascinating question. Where did life begin? And when you think about that question, you realize, first of all, that Earth's continents have shifted, so you can't really say it occurred in North America or that North America didn't exist. One possibility, though, that people have talked about is if life happened very, very early, then the first place that you might have had liquid water that could survive would be at the cooler poles. And so it's very possible that if life occurs very, very quickly, if it emerges quickly, and it needs just liquid water and chemicals where an environment's cool enough, it could be the North Pole or the South Pole. But other than that, I think it's very, very difficult to imagine yourself back to that time and understand geography. Yeah, no, I don't know of any other key that would tell us the latitude or longitude of an origin.
I got a couple of questions. How has the exploration of Mars influenced your studies, especially because most of the exploration is basically mineral-based there? And if life is discovered there, how can we use that to kind of prove or disprove some of the concepts that you've talked about?
Great questions. In terms of Mars mineralogy, this is something I've been following very closely, and some of my colleagues in the Mineral Ecology Project are on the Mars Curiosity team looking at the minerals. And what we find so far is the mineral distribution on Mars, and by the way, on the Moon as well, are very, very different from Earth's. They're not large number of rare event distributions. And we at least have tentatively proposing that the large number of rare event distribution we see on Earth is itself a signature of life, a biosignature. So that's really an intriguing idea. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. And the second question. What?
If we do discover life on Mars.
Oh, if we discover life on Mars, yeah. So the first thing everybody's going to do is see if it has the same biochemistry as life on Earth. if it has the same set of 20 amino acids that build proteins, if it uses left-handed amino acids and right-handed sugars, then we have to assume that there was one origin and that we're seeing contamination of Earth on Mars or Mars on Earth. But if it's a different biochemistry, it's the second genesis. This is what people in the game talk about, second genesis. If you find a different biochemistry, then that proves life is everywhere. And it's 0, 1, many. And that's kind of a rule in science. They're unique things, but if they're two, then there's lots.
Last question, thank you.
In these planetary collisions or the asteroids hitting in the Cretaceous or whatever, is there any chance that fragments of life went into space, and is there any chance that it survived?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the things people think very much about. It's easier to imagine orbital dynamics of something smashing into Mars, transferring meteors which land on Earth, and transferring life, therefore, from Mars to Earth. But there are scenarios for orbital dynamics, I understand, that could move an Earth meteor out to the orbit of Mars, and it's much more difficult dynamically, but it's not an impossibility.
So get tickets. All right, well, thanks again, Bob.
Thank you.